Hello historians. Today in class we did our activity about the Civil War morgue. You can kind of see in the directions students worked in teams. They went around the classroom and they were observing and examining five different bodies, not real of course, but 5 people who died during the Civil War. If you missed today, then I'm sorry because it was kind of a fun activity. But then afterwards, after the students saw each of the bodies, we went through and I went over the information with students to fill into the packet. So if you missed today, the expectation is that you will grab one of these packets or print one off from our Google Classroom site and go through the video and fill in the notes, okay? So I had a timer up and the kids moved from body to body, and then we started looking at each one. Now here's a picture of the inside of what a medical examiner or an autopsy or coroner's workstation would kind of look like. Okay, but not back in the Civil War times. This is what it would look like today. But we're looking at a couple of different bodies. So body number 1, this was supposed to be for a young man named Private Alan Haley from the CSA, the Confederate States. So he's a Southern soldier. Students observed the body and then made little notes on their paper about what had happened to the body. In this situation, this boy was 18. The cause of his death was smallpox. He had his left leg amputated below the knee. He had black bumps indicating smallpox, and he had the beginning of gangrene, an infection at the site of amputation. So his story, the Confederate Private Alan Haley was shot at Gettysburg. His leg was removed, amputated, but before Haley had gone off to battle, he had been exposed to smallpox, and that is what actually ended up killing him. Okay, so here's an example of what gangrene looks like on an infected leg. It's pretty nasty. And this is what smallpox looks like. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about some of these things. 618,000 total military fatalities, the most of any American war. In fact, if you added up the casualties of Americans that fought and died in all of the other wars that we've been a part of combined, you still wouldn't reach the total that we had for the Civil War of about 620,000 fatalities and casualties. But a third of those casualties are the ones that are wounds on the battlefield and trauma. 2/3, more than twice as many, are from diseases, poor diet, infections and things that they usually often got from the military medical facilities. We'll talk about why in just a second. But one of the reasons the fatalities and the casualties were so high in this war is because we had increased new technologies, especially with our bullets and our rifles. The North was using the 1861 Springfield rifle, and they also used a new version of a bullet called the mini ball. And we've talked about this. I actually had some to show students as well. You can see it's a conical shape, so that improves the aerodynamics of it. So it's going to go further, faster, and it's going to be more accurate. And it's got these grooves here to kind of hook into the rifling inside of the ridges inside of the rifle's barrel, and that sends the bullet speeding out in a spiral shape, so it's going to make it a lot more deadly and accurate. Okay, and because of that, this kind of bullet left a larger wound. It also did more damage to bones as it went into the body. So the South thought that the North was using exploding bullets, but really it was the new mini ball bullets that caused bones to fragment and kind of burst and create more trauma and do more damage to internal organs, because the shrapnel from the bone helped increase the amount of damage done internally. Okay, shattering bones, large gaping wounds. Here's what the inside of a medical tent might look like nearby a battlefield. Okay, if this is situated in a battlefield zone, you can probably assume that there's not going to be a whole lot of ways to sanitize things and keep things clean. But they also didn't know the importance of that quite yet during this time period. So surgeons didn't understand this idea of sterilization. This was right before germ theory was a thing, and before they had an understanding of bacteria and things like that. Medical instruments were often wiped off on dirty aprons or dipped in buckets of bloody stagnant water, which of course is just going to spread germs and diseases and gross. The most common surgical procedure of the war was amputation. Okay, so here's an example of some of the different tools that would have been in a medical bag at this time. Our second body was that of Sergeant Thomas Roberts. Okay, he was 23. This one's a Yankee. He had abrasions to both wrists, sunburns on his head and shoulders, green dots throughout his body. His ribs were showing signs of malnourishment, hunger. He had a scar on his right shoulder. His cause of death is going to be from disease. His story was that he's a Northern soldier captured by the Southern Army and taken to as a prisoner of war to Andersonville prison camp. And at Andersonville, most people died of starvation because they were given very little food. They also had very little in terms of shelter, so they were exposed to the elements, and also there was a lack of sanitation, so there was often diseases that spread really quickly. Okay, so here's a photograph of a prison camp during the Civil War. Okay, this is a photograph of Andersonville Prison in Georgia, which is the most infamous Southern prison camp in the Civil War. Okay, let's talk about military prisons. Both sides of the war, the North and the South, took prisoners of war, and they had prison camps. Federal troops imprisoned in the South were often starving because the South was struggling to feed its own soldiers, so they weren't going to use what little resources they had to take care of Northern soldiers that they kept as prisoners. They had very little shelter. As you can see, they're like constructing things out of whatever they can find. Okay, often soldiers were put in pens with no covering. Maybe all they had was their clothing. Okay, thousands died from bad food or lack of food, poor sanitation, overcrowding, lack of shelter, exposure to elements, and then lack of health care, because they weren't going to send their military doctors to go and examine Northern soldiers when they were much needed on the battlefront. So here's an example of where you could see, okay, Camp Sumter is what it's technically called. It's in Andersonville, Georgia. That's the most infamous prison camp. But you can see that there were other Southern prison camps here, and then we also had Northern prisoner of war camps. All right, body number 3 is that of Mrs. Betsy Ralston. Okay, she's 32 years old. She's from Richmond, Virginia. She showed signs of hunger, dehydration, and disease. Her cause of death is going to be typhus that she contracts when she's in prison. Her story is that she was a Southern woman, and she was likely a mother of children. Her husband was likely off to war. Especially people living in the cities in the South were struggling with food because they couldn't grow their own. Like you could maybe, if you had a farm or a plantation that had a place to grow a garden, so that could make it a little bit easier to feed your family. But during the war, the South had enough trouble trying to feed their own troops. It was often that people were struggling to find food and access food. So in this situation, Mrs. Ralston joined a group of other women who went into the city, into Richmond, to protest the conditions. After enough mothers had watched their children go to bed hungry day after day, many of them started to be pretty upset and become more vocal. This protest turned into a riot where women were smashing windows and basically stealing from businesses so that they could take food home to their families. Okay. In this situation, Betsy Ralston was sentenced to 5 years for her part in the riot. So she was at Richmond Prison where she contracted typhus and died. Okay, the Southern economy, we've talked about this, it's agrarian based, it's farm based, but they relied on, the South's economy relied on selling their exports, cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo. Many of these things you're not going to want to eat. You don't eat your cotton, you don't eat your tobacco. They needed to make money for their economy by selling those things to other countries. Okay, we talked about how the problem with that is that the South had to try to work with around the Union's naval blockade. Um, and so this was a really difficult thing. Many the Southerners were unable to sell their crops because the North was no longer buying it, and it was really difficult to try to sell it to other countries because you had to try to get around that naval blockade. So without being able to sell um, and bring in money from outside to try to improve your region's economy, um, the government, the Southern government started to print more money, and we've talked about how just printing money without actually having wealth coming into the national treasury doesn't do anything. It just actually causes inflation, which means the more money you print, the less value each piece of each dollar has. We talked in class about using an analogy of a large pizza. Let's say you have a large pizza and it's 14 inches in diameter. Okay, you have the same amount of pizza whether you cut it into 8 pieces or 10 pieces, right? So inflation is kind of like, or printing money without actually bringing more wealth into your economy is just like cutting the same amount of pizza into smaller slices. The more money you print, it's like the more slices you're adding to your pizza. That just means that each slice is worth less pizza. And that's kind of how we've been describing what printing money does to a country's economy. So basically the Confederate dollars were not worth anything at all. Confederacy had difficulty paying their soldiers. Some soldiers were unable to send money home. They're not working because they're off fighting. The Southern Army often lacked outfits and uniforms, and food for their army. And then also the citizens were struggling. Okay, so our body number 4 is a John Doe. Now we've talked about how a John Doe is kind of a code name for an unidentified person that they need to figure out whose body this is. So there was evidence that was found with this person to try to figure out who he was. This particular victim suffered from a gunshot wound to the back of the head, and we asked, who is Mr. John Doe? He is actually Abraham Lincoln. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth while watching the play My American Cousin. Okay. Lincoln and his wife sat at the state box in the balcony at Ford's Theater. They watched the play. As they watched the play, assassin John Wilkes Booth snuck in from behind, fired a single round slug from a .44 caliber at point blank range into the president's head. There's John Wilkes Booth. The bullet entered behind Lincoln's left ear and lodged behind his right eye. The president was carried across the street to the Peterson house, where Army Surgeon Joseph Barnes probed for fragments in Lincoln's skull, and the bullet lodged 6 inches inside of his brain. Okay, Lincoln never regained consciousness. He was in a coma for 9 hours before he was officially pronounced dead at 7:22 a.m. April 15th, 1865. The other thing we talked about was how this was only 5 days after the South had surrendered at Appomattox. So the war has only been over for about 5 days. Some interesting photographs, because photography was brand new at the time. I think this photo is pretty amazing. And our last body is that of Private James Caldwell. He was 19 years old, enlisted in the Union Army in Bedford, Massachusetts. His place of death was Fort Wagner, South Carolina. He was a private in the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, and he died of gunshot wounds. Okay, there's a photograph of the Massachusetts 54th. Here's a map of Fort Wagner in South Carolina. The Massachusetts 54th Regiment was one of the first all-black regiments for the Union Army. After Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, nearly 200,000 escaped slaves and free blacks enlisted in the Union Army and Navy. Fort Wagner was a military fort held by the Confederates to protect the city of Charleston, South Carolina. The Battle of Fort Wagner took place on July 18th, 1863. This is where the Massachusetts 54th made a valiant sacrifice. The regiment volunteered to be first in this attack, to lead the attack, and in doing so, they lost 280 of their men. The valor of the 54th against hopeless odds proved the worth of black soldiers. It showed Northerners, who were kind of questioning if they should have allowed African Americans to fight in this war, that they truly were dedicated to this cause, and it spurred additional recruitment for the Union from white and black soldiers alike. The Union besieged the fort after the unsuccessful assault, and during almost 60 days of heavy shelling, the Confederates abandoned it September 7th, 1863. So that concludes our notes